In the previous lecture, we saw how the oscillation part, when Fourier transform, gives us the frequency that helps you understand the chemical shift and scalar coupling. In this lecture, we will be looking at the remaining component of this time domain signal, which is FID, and understand how this relaxation plays a role in the final spectrum that we end up obtaining. You would remember that the time domain signal which we obtain from the transverse axis when Fourier transformed gives you the frequency domain spectrum, and this frequency domain spectrum is characterized by Lorentzian line shapes. So what do we mean by that? We get the resonances at capital omega, which is the offset with respect to the transmitter frequency, and you have two components, the real component which is given by R2 divided by R2 square plus capital omega minus small omega the whole square, and the imaginary component which is capital omega minus omega the whole divided by R2 square plus capital omega minus omega the whole square. We also briefly understood that we like the real part than the imaginary part as it decays as 1 over omega square, whereas the imaginary part decays as 1 over omega, resulting in broader shoulders. So we tend to pick this part of the signal, which we call as the absorptive part, and the part that we generally don't like to use is the dispersive. The terms come up here because the dispersive part looks like this, while the absorptive part looks like this. In the absorptive part, when you get the resonance at omega, the full width at half maxima or the full width at half height will be given by R2 by pi. In reality, you get something like R2 star by pi. This R2 star is nothing but a combination of the pure R2, which arises due to relaxation, and also due to inhomogeneity of the magnetic fields. Meaning, let's say if you are applying a B0 field, you expect the lines of force that traverse through your sample are as parallel as possible. Let's say you had a condition that looked like this, where you are able to see the magnetic lines of force are not parallel to each other. This will result in the fact that the different spins that are present in your sample ends up seeing different B0. Remember, this is in addition to the shielding that you have been introduced to in the previous lecture. So what this results in is that each spin has its own different effective field that it observes, which comes up due to the inhomogeneity of the magnetic field. So generally what people end up doing is that they do a process called shimming, where the small electromagnets that are present around your sample, the current through them is altered such that you would try to go as close as possible to the homogeneous magnetic field strength. Although we say this, in reality, you can never get rid of the inhomogeneity. The resonances that you are seeing here are in the order of a few hertz. So even subtle differences would be picked up in R2, so which is why generally when you measure, you end up getting R2 star. Let's try to understand what is the pure R2 that you would end up measuring. This pure R2 would be modulated by size of the molecule. In addition, conformational dynamics also affects the intrinsic relaxation rate. We will not go into detail of what conformational dynamics is in this entire course. The fact that I want you to pay more close attention to is the molecular size. It is a very well known fact that as you increase molecular size, the R2 increases. This is quite detrimental for us because if R2 increases, understand that the line width also increases. Understand that if the resonances become broader and broader, any two resonances that are really close to each other due to similarity of their chemical shift would end up being lost. Therefore, it is imperative for us to understand how R2 changes with the molecular size. With increase of molecular size, the isotropic tumbling that is characterized by the value called tau c increases, and this tau c is related to the size of the molecule. Assuming you are a spherical molecule, tau c given by 4 by 3 pi RH cube times eta by kBt. The RH is the hydrodynamic radius of the molecule that you are working with, assuming a sphere, which is why you get the 4 by 3 pi r cube kind of volume dependency. And eta is the viscosity of the medium, T being the absolute temperature and Kb being the Boltzmann's constant. It is quite obvious for us to understand as the molecular weight increases, the molecular size increases, the radius of the molecule will also increase. As the radius of the molecule increases, tau c therefore increases in this fashion. In addition to the molecular size, you are also able to understand rotational correlation time, which dictates the R2, is also dependent on two other parameters, one being the viscosity of the medium and that of the temperature. Which is why generally when people do NMR, they try to have as non-viscous solvent as possible. As the eta starts increasing, tau c starts to increase and therefore R2 starts increasing, and you will have extensive broadening of resonance. In addition, performing NMR at room temperature or slightly higher temperature is also okay, which helps you reduce the overall tumbling time. In the case of biomolecular NMR, where we end up using water as our solvent, we add buffers to it so as to keep the biomolecules such as proteins and RNA stable. In such case, what ends up happening, it alters the viscosity of the solvent a little bit. If you have more and more salt, you would end up having a more viscous solution. So therefore, lower salts are preferred. When you increase the temperature, the viscosity further changes because viscosity also is dependent on temperature. In the case that we are trying to work where you reduce the temperature, due to which water becomes more viscous, then you are going to a condition where tau c increases due to both the factors of eta increasing and T decreasing. On the other hand, let's say you are going to a condition where you are reducing the viscosity. Let's say we have water and we add a little bit of ethanol to it, and you are increasing temperature, then the tau c will get reduced. These are some of the tricks that are played by NMR spectroscopists in order to get a better spectrum for a given molecular size. Let's say for the same given solvent and temperature, if you want to compare different molecules, as you keep increasing molecular weight, the volume of the molecule increases, which results in increased rotational correlation time, which increases R2 and therefore results in very broad resonances. Just because of the mere fact that we end up having broad resonances, you would see that other technological advances in NMR such as multidimensional NMR came into place so that we can overcome such limitations. It's quite common to use a deuterated solvent in NMR spectroscopy so as to make sure the fields do not drift. So we just saw the fact that you need to have a homogeneous field, but it also matters that the field doesn't drift. This could happen largely because you are using very high magnetic field strengths, and therefore this magnetic field strengths could get perturbed due to subtle changes that happen in the surroundings. In order to make sure that doesn't happen, we end up using a deuterated solvent in our system. For organic molecules, it's quite common to use deuterated chloroform and DMSO D6. Since we are working with biomolecules which are soluble in water, we end up using D2O. I want you to go back and think about the fact, how does viscosity change with addition of D2O? And remember, the properties of the solvent also changes when you have heavier isotope. For instance, the freezing point ends up changing. Let's say we take a small protein, which is a model protein for all NMR spectroscope, is called ubiquitin. This protein ends up having a tau c 3.8 nanoseconds at 300 Kelvin. This calculated value, when compared with the measured value of 4.1 nanoseconds, nicely agrees with each other, largely because this protein is quite spherical in nature. In addition to the factors that were just discussed on the hydrodynamic radius, the R2 also depends upon the spins that are present next to each other. For instance, let's say you have a proton that is coupled to carbon 13 versus a proton that is coupled to carbon 12. You would see that the relaxation rate for the proton coupled to carbon 12 will be lesser because this is an NMR inactive nuclei while this is an NMR active nuclei. So generally, in order to reduce the rate of relaxation, people also play with their samples such that they would end up changing the spins in order to make sure they have desirable properties towards acquiring the data. In many cases, since you want to get the carbon chemical shift to get a structure, people end up deuterating some of the spins so that the dipolar relaxation that might end up coming due to the proton that is present is minimized. This will be much lower than that of 1H. So it's a very common feature that is employed by biomolecular NMR spectroscopists. So therefore, in order to summarize this entire lecture, I hope I have given you a little bit of impression on the fact what decides the relaxation. We are able to realize that the solvent and the temperature at which NMR is done influences the line width and the relaxation rate. Generally, proteins whose molecular weight goes higher than 25 kilodalton requires special NMR techniques in order to be observable. Fortunately, a lot of methodological advancements have been done. Hopefully, we will have time to look at some of them in the course. The spin-spin relaxation that ends up coming in these molecules could also be altered by switching the dipolar spin to a quadrupolar spin, where the relaxation rate between this spin when being observed, that is, let's say you're observing 13C spin for a dipolar spin, is much lower, and therefore you will be able to benefit from narrower line widths.